wind howls across the desolate slopes of the Isle of Man, carrying secrets that no living soul should ever hear. High atop the bleak hill known as Cashen Gap stood a lonely farmhouse that became the epicenter of a baffling supernatural siege. During the early 1930s, this isolated stone cottage was home to the Irving family, who found themselves trapped in a waking nightmare. They were not alone in the darkness, for something ancient and malicious had claimed their home. It began with subtle noises scratching inside the hollow walls, but soon evolved into a terrifying psychological ordeal that captivated the world. The entity that infested their lives was not a typical phantom or a silent specter. It was a loud and aggressive presence that defied all logic and reason, bringing madness to the moors. James Irving was a pragmatic man who had moved his family to this remote outpost, seeking a quiet life of farming and solitude. He lived there with his wife Margaret and their young daughter Voirie. The farmhouse was a sturdy structure built of cold stone, intended to withstand the harsh weather of the Irish Sea. However, the thick walls that protected them from the elements soon became the prison bars of their own home. The isolation of Doarlish Cashen meant that when the trouble started, there was nowhere to run and no one to hear their screams. The bleak landscape surrounding the house seemed to absorb the light, leaving the family vulnerable to the encroaching shadows. They were miles from the nearest village, creating a suffocating atmosphere of dread. The haunting began innocuously enough in the autumn of 1931, with sounds that resembled the scurrying of rats. James Irving assumed it was a simple vermin infestation and set traps throughout the house, hoping to catch the intruders. But the traps remained empty while the noises grew louder and more deliberate. The scratching sounds moved from the attic to the space behind the wooden paneling of the bedroom walls. It sounded less like an animal foraging for food and more like a creature testing the strength of the barriers separating it from the family. The scratching rhythm became intelligent, often mimicking the number of fingers tapped against the wall by James. This was the first sign that they were dealing with a conscious entity rather than a beast. As the weeks passed, the entity grew bolder, and the sounds transformed into something far more disturbing than mere scratching. The family began to hear strange vocalizations that sounded like a baby gurgling or a dog barking in the distance. These sounds emanated from the voids within the walls, echoing through the silent house at all hours of the night. Margaret Irving felt a growing sense of unease, as if unseen eyes were watching her every move from the darkness. The atmosphere in the house became heavy and oppressive, weighing down on their spirits. They tried to ignore the bizarre occurrences, but the entity refused to be dismissed. It wanted attention, and it was willing to escalate its behavior to ensure it was the center of their world. The turning point came when the entity finally found its voice. and spoke to them in human language. It started with high-pitched squeaks that gradually formed into garbled words, and then into clear sentences. The voice was shrill and piercing, sounding like a mixture of a small child and an old man. It introduced itself as Gef and claimed to be an extra clever mongoose born in India in 1852. This declaration was absurd, yet the malice behind the voice was palpable. Gef explained that he was an earthbound spirit who could shape-shift and travel unseen. The family was paralyzed with fear as the voice taunted them from the shadows, claiming dominion over their home and their lives. Gef proved to be a volatile and unpredictable house guest who delighted in tormenting the Irvings with his erratic behavior. He would hurl objects across the room with invisible hands and spit water at them when they displeased him. His moods swung violently from playful to murderous in the blink of an eye. One moment, he would be singing nursery rhymes in his shrill voice, and the next, he would be threatening to kill them all in their sleep. The psychological toll on the family was immense, as they could never relax in their own home. They were forced to coexist with a monster that claimed to be a mongoose, but acted like a poltergeist with a cruel sense of humor. The physical description of Gef remained elusive, as he rarely showed himself fully to the family or visitors. On the rare occasions he was glimpsed, he appeared to be a small yellowish animal with a bushy tail and flat snout. However, his features seemed to shift and blur in the dim light, making it difficult to pin down his true form. He moved with supernatural speed, darting through cracks in the walls and vanishing before he could be caught. James Irving became obsessed with documenting the creature, keeping detailed diaries of every interaction. He treated the haunting as a scientific curiosity, trying to understand the nature of the being that held his family hostage. Voirrey Irving, the teenage daughter, bore the brunt of the suspicion and the psychological torment, because the entity seemed most active when she was present. Many outsiders accused her of ventriloquism. They believed she was creating the voice to seek attention or to cope with the isolation of the farm. Yet the parents insisted that they heard the voice when Voirrey was asleep or in another room entirely. The girl became a pariah in the local community, bullied by peers and whispered about by neighbors. She was trapped between the terror of the entity inside her home and the judgment of the world outside. Her youth was stolen by the shadow of the mongoose. News of the talking mongoose spread beyond the Isle of Man, attracting the attention of the British press and paranormal researchers. Journalists descended on Doarlish Cashen, Hungary, for a sensational story to sell newspapers. The profound isolation of the farm was broken by a steady stream of curiosity seekers and skeptics. Gef seemed to relish the attention, often performing for visitors by singing songs or gossiping about the neighbors. He acted as a supernatural surveillance system, claiming to know the secrets of everyone in the valley. The Irvings found themselves at the center of a media circus that turned their private horror into a public spectacle. Among the investigators who took an interest in the case was the famous ghost hunter, Harry Price. Price was a man of science and skepticism who was determined to expose the truth behind the haunting. He traveled to the Isle of Man with modern recording equipment, hoping to capture definitive proof of Gef. However, the entity seemed to know when Price was coming, and often went silent or hid during his visits. Gef mocked the investigator from behind the walls, calling him names and refusing to cooperate. This game of cat and mouse only deepened the mystery, leaving Price frustrated and unable to debunk the phenomenon completely. The relationship between James Irving and Gef was complex and disturbing, bordering on a strange friendship. James spent hours conversing with the voice in the walls, asking it questions about the universe and the afterlife. Gef would respond with cryptic riddles or blatant lies, keeping the old man engaged in a twisted dialogue. It seemed as though the entity was feeding off the attention and energy of the patriarch. James became defensive of Gef, often referring to him as a part of the family despite the terror he caused. This Stockholm Syndrome dynamic alienated James from the rest of the world as he sank deeper into the delusion. Gef often boasted about his ability to hunt and kill, claiming to provide food for the family. He would leave dead rabbits and strangled rodents on the doorstep as grotesque gifts. The family was repulsed, yet they were living in poverty and sometimes accepted the offerings. This transactional relationship added a layer of grim reality to the haunting. The entity was not just a voice, but a physical force capable of taking life. The sight of the small, twisted bodies of the animals served as a constant reminder of what Gef could do if he turned his aggression fully upon the humans. As the years dragged on, the haunting of Doarlish Cashen began to drain the life force of the Irving family. Margaret was in a constant state of anxiety, her health deteriorating under the stress of the sleepless nights. She pleaded with James to leave the farm, but he refused to abandon his home and his strange companion. The house fell into disrepair as the family focused all their energy on appeasing the monster in the walls. The damp, cold air of the Isle of Man seeped into their bones, mirroring the chill that Gef brought to their souls. They were prisoners in a jail of their own making, guarding a secret that was slowly destroying them. The entity often made blood-curdling threats that left the family shaking in their beds. Gef would whisper graphic descriptions of how he would hurt them, promising to tear out their eyes or burn the house down. He seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger whenever they showed weakness. There were nights when the banging on the walls was so violent that plaster would fall from the ceiling. The family would huddle together in one room, waiting for the sun to rise and banish the darkness. But even the daylight offered little safety, as Gef would continue his harassment regardless of the hour. Despite the investigations and the media frenzy, no concrete evidence of Gef was ever produced. The photographs taken by Voiry were blurry and inconclusive, often looking more like a fur stole or a rock than an animal. The hair samples and paw prints that James collected were analyzed by scientists, but the results were ambiguous. Some said the hair belonged to a dog, while others could not identify the species. This lack of proof fueled the skeptics, who dismissed the entire affair as a hoax orchestrated by the family. Yet the Irvings stuck to their story, maintaining until the end that Gef was real. The ambiguity of the haunting is what makes it so terrifying and enduring. Was Gef a demonic entity manifesting as an animal to mock creation? Was he a poltergeist generated by the suppressed energy of a lonely teenager? Or was he a shared delusion born from the madness of isolation? The answer remains elusive, buried beneath the peat and stone of the Isle of Man. The story operates on the fringe of reality, where the impossible bleeds into the mundane. It challenges our understanding of the supernatural, suggesting that the unknown can be absurd as well as terrifying. Eventually, the relentless pressure became too much for the Irving family to bear. James Irving passed away in 1945, leaving Margaret and Voiry alone with the entity. Without the anchor of James, the women decided it was finally time to escape the cursed farmhouse. They sold the property for a pittance and moved to the mainland, leaving behind their furniture and their memories. They hoped that by leaving the physical location, they could leave the ghost behind. But the trauma of their years at Doarlish Cashen would follow them for the rest of their lives. The farmhouse was purchased by a man named Leslie Graham, who was a pragmatic actor and had no patience for ghost stories. He claimed that he never heard a voice or saw a mongoose during his time on the property. However, shortly after moving in, he trapped and killed a strange-looking animal on the land. He displayed the body to the press, claiming that he had finally killed Gef. The animal was black and white and larger than a weasel, but did not match the yellow description given by the Irvings. Voiry saw the body and vehemently denied that it was Gef, stating that her tormentor was far different. The death of the animal did not bring an end to the legend, but the farmhouse itself met a grim fate. The structure was eventually demolished, leaving only a pile of rubble on the wind-swept hill. The physical vessel of the haunting was destroyed, but the stories lingered in the local folklore. The site of Doarlish Cashen became a place of dark pilgrimage for those obsessed with the paranormal. Even without the walls to echo the voice, the location retained an aura of unease. The wind whistling through the grass still sounds like a high-pitched whisper to those who listen closely. Irving lived the rest of her life in the shadow of the talking mongoose, trying to distance herself from the legend. She refused to talk about Gef for many years, traumatized by the bullying and the accusations of fraud. In her final interviews, she maintained her innocence, insisting that she did not create the voice. She spoke with a bitterness about the entity that had stolen her childhood and ruined her family's reputation. To her, Gef was not a funny story or a scientific curiosity, but a curse that had blighted her existence. The psychological aspect of the story suggests a dark manifestation of the subconscious mind. Some theories propose that Gef was a tulpa, a thought form created by intense mental concentration. The isolation and emotional repression of the Irving family might have birthed a psychic entity that took on a life of its own. This explanation is perhaps more terrifying than a ghost, because it implies that we create our own monsters. The mind, when left in the dark for too long, can conjure demons that are indistinguishable from reality. There were moments of lucid cruelty where Gef seemed to possess knowledge that the family could not possibly have known. He spoke of events happening in the village before the news reached the farm. He knew the contents of sealed letters and the private thoughts of visitors. This clairvoyant ability terrified James Irving more than the physical poltergeist activity. It meant that there were no secrets from Gef, and that privacy was an illusion. The entity was an all-seeing eye that judged them from the safety of the wall voids. The legend of Gef challenges the binary view of good and evil in ghost stories. He was not purely a demon trying to possess them, nor was he a benevolent spirit. He was a trickster entity existing in a gray area of morality. He helped them at times by catching mice and warning of intruders, but he also threatened their lives. This unpredictability is a hallmark of the Fey folk, or ancient spirits of the land. It suggests that Gef was something older than the farm, a primal force of the Isle of Man that had been disturbed. As we look back at the case of the talking mongoose, it serves as a grim reminder of the power of belief. Whether Gef was a physical creature or a psychological projection, he was real enough to destroy a family. The fear he generated was genuine, and the sleepless nights were tangible. The story is a tragedy of isolation, where the lines between the natural and supernatural were erased. It stands as a testament to the strange and dark corners of the world, where logic holds no sway. The recordings and transcripts left behind by investigators offer a chilling glimpse into the madness of Doarlish Cashen. Reading the dialogue of Gef 1 is struck by the manic energy and the malice hidden in the jokes. It is the voice of something that is mimicking humanity, but does not understand it. The laughter of the mongoose is devoid of joy, sounding more like the cackle of a creature delighting in chaos. These records are the black box of a haunting that crashed and burned leaving no survivors. Even today, researchers analyze the evidence, trying to find the smoking gun that proves or disproves the haunting. Audio analysts study the few existing snippets of alleged recordings, looking for signs of manipulation. Psychologists review the diaries of James, Irving, searching for symptoms of shared psychosis. Yet the mystery refuses to be solved. Every explanation has a flaw, and every theory leaves loose ends. Gef remains an enigma, a puzzle piece that does not fit into the picture of reality. The legacy of Gef is a cautionary tale about the dangers of engaging with the unknown. James Irving invited the entity into his life by conversing with it and giving it a name. He fed the monster with his attention and his obsession until it grew too strong to control. It is a classic horror trope played out in real life, showing that when you stare into the abyss stares back, and sometimes it speaks. The curiosity of man is often his downfall, leading him down paths that end in madness. The landscape of the Isle of Man remains as stark and beautiful as it was in the 1930s. The mist still rolls in from the sea, blanketing the hills in a suffocating white shroud. If one were to stand at the site of the old farmhouse at twilight, they might feel the hair on their neck stand up. The energy of the place is tainted by the years of fear and confusion that occurred there. It is a scar on the land, a spiritual wound that has never fully healed. Ultimately, the story of Gef, the Talking Mongoose, is not about a funny animal, but about the disintegration of a family. It is a domestic horror story set against the backdrop of a bleak and unforgiving wilderness. The true horror lies not in the supernatural feats, but in the human suffering. It is about a father losing his grip on reality, a mother living in constant terror, and a daughter stripped of her innocence. The monster in the wall was the catalyst for their destruction. As the final echo of the story fades, we are left with a lingering sense of dread. The idea that something could invade our homes and our minds without permission is a primal fear. Gef represents the chaos that lies just outside the orderly walls of civilization. He is the scratch in the wall, the whisper in the dark, the shadow that moves when you are not looking. And though the farmhouse is gone, the question remains waiting in the silence. What was he really? And is he still out there listening in the dark?